Well, we are grateful for the presence of each one of you here today. Just before coming up here, I was given an announcement that I was asked to relay to everyone. Martha Spikes Rampy, this is the daughter of the late Helen Spikes. As most of us know, she's been battling cancer for quite some time, and they have called in hospice for her. So we need to keep that family in our prayers at this time. Again, that is Martha Spikes Rampy. It's the daughter of the late Helen Spikes. So please remember that family in your prayers at this time. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon after Jesus had spent 6 excruciating hours hanging on the cross. He uttered 4 statements in fairly rapid succession. Starting off, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" A few moments later, he uttered the words, "I thirst." And then as time drew close, he cried out, "It is finished." And then he cried out with a loud voice, and he says, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." The gospel accounts record for us that this first statement, my God, why have you forsaken me?" and this last statement, "Into your hands I commit my spirit," Jesus cried out with a loud voice. And after uttering these words, it says that Jesus laid his head upon his chest and he yielded up his spirit to God. Well, Matthew's gospel is unique in that immediately following the death of Jesus, Matthew records for us 4 miracles. 4 miracles that took place to signify the importance of the event that had just taken place. He mentions the tearing of the veil of the temple. He mentions an earthquake that split the rocks and shook the earth. He mentions the opening of tombs around Jerusalem, and those sainted dead, those who had been faithful to Christ, who had passed from this life, they came back to life. They came out of the tombs and they were seen around the city of Jerusalem. But the last miracle was a proclamation. And this proclamation was from a group of people that would have been the least likely to proclaim who Jesus was. The centurion and the soldiers who had crucified Jesus, who had carried out this heinous task, when they looked around and they saw all of the things that were transpiring, they made a statement. They said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Now, brethren, given the fact that this was Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the second member of the Godhead, who was hanging on that cross, who died, it stands to reason that something spectacular would accompany that. We should not be surprised to see that miracles occurred, signifying the importance of the death of Jesus Christ. But we find other instances in the life and the ministry of Christ as well that were punctuated by miracles. You may remember that the night that Jesus was born, in Luke 2, verses 13 through 14, there was a company of angels that proclaimed that Jesus was born. You may remember at the time of his baptism, when he came to the Jordan to be baptized of John, in Matthew 3, verses 16 and 17, that immediately upon coming up out of the waters, the voice of God was heard, audibly, pointedly, saying, "This is my beloved Son." So it stands to reason, when something as significant as the death of Jesus was to take place, that there would be something spectacular to signify this event as well. This morning, I would like for us to focus in upon just one of these miracles, an earthquake that took place. An earthquake that split the rocks and shook the earth. And to be specific, what was the testimony of these rocks? in the passage that Brother Ed shared with us just a few moments ago, it took place exactly 1 week before the crucifixion of Christ. And Jesus made a statement at that time that if his disciples were suddenly to become silent, that all of this praise, all of this rejoicing was to stop, that the rocks would cry out. Well, brethren, I stand before you today and I say this, that 1 week later, the rocks cried out. And the rocks cried out in a very powerful way. And they proclaimed to those who witnessed those events 3 things. And they continue to proclaim those 3 things to us today, starting out with this. The rocks proclaimed, do you understand who this is? This earthquake, with the rocks being split, with the earth shaking, it proclaimed to all of those that were there on that day that this is not just another man. That this man truly is the Son of God. Now you stop and you think about the question that had been troubling so many people up to this point. We think about the arrest of Jesus. We think about the trials that he stood before with Pilate and with Herod. We think about his march to Calvary. We think about the mocking that took place while he was there. And the question that everybody was concerned with, is he really who he says he is? Is he really the Son of God? You know, this was the issue that the Jewish leaders had with him. Their issue was not so much that he was teaching. Their issue with Jesus was that he was claiming to be the Messiah. He was claiming to be the one that was going to fulfill all of these prophecies concerning the Messiah, was going to bring to fulfillment the old law, was going to usher in this new covenant. And those questions were always there. Is this really who he is? Is he really the Son of God? Well, of course, the Jewish leaders discounted that. Of course he's not the Son of God. He's simply a mere mortal man. Here he is. He's in the flesh. The Son of God is not going to be in the flesh. The Son of God is going to be in some type of holy celestial frame. But yet, when the rocks cried out on that day, they cried out, Jesus is the Son of God. In fact, as the Jews put it in John 19 and verse 7, they said that Jesus was making himself out to be the Son of God. Well, Matthew tells us that all of these questions and the answers to these questions reached its climax in this earthquake. When the earth quaked upon that day, even those who were there, who were a part of this pagan nation of the Romans, even they were able to witness the things that happened and understand the significance of what they were seeing. Notice Matthew 27 and verse 54 where it says, Now the centurion and those who were with him keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening, they became very frightened and said, now notice this, truly this was the Son of God. Now, brethren, let me ask you a question. Who can look at the account of what took place? Who can read these scriptures and see the things that occurred on that day and not come to the same answer as the centurion? Who can look at this and see the things that was occurring? The veil of the temple being torn, this earthquake, the dead coming back out of their tombs. What other answer can we come to? We can't. We can't. John said that the recording of these signs in John 20 and verse 31 says that it's been done so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So initially, yes, the rocks cried out, understand who this is. Understand that this is the Son of God. But that's not all that the rocks cried out. The rocks also cried out and said, do you understand what has happened? Understand what's going on here on this day. This earthquake was a testimony to the fulfillment of God's plan. Oftentimes, God used earthquakes to punctuate the significance of certain occasions. You may remember that while the children of Israel were out in the wilderness, they came to the base of Mount Sinai. And they looked up upon Mount Sinai, and there was a great cloud of smoke that was billowing around that, and the earth was shaking. What was the significance of that earthquake? God was there. And the significance of that was that the first covenant, this covenant that we now call the law of Moses or the old law, it was about to come into establishment. It was about to be handed down from that mountain to God's chosen leader Moses. And God signified that with an earthquake. Moses said, now Mount Sinai was all in smoke because of the presence of the Lord. The Lord descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked violently. Exodus chapter 19 and verse 18. But then we can move over into the book of Psalms, and in Psalm 68 and verse 8, it's recorded that Sinai itself quaked at the presence of God, the God of Israel. Now, a question that often arises, well, God had to depart from Christ while he was on the cross, correct? God had to turn his back upon Christ because Christ was bearing the sins of the world. This is why Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? But folks, just because God had to turn his back on Christ does not mean that God was not present at the cross. Folks, our God is always present everywhere. He was at the cross. He saw the things that were transpiring, and his very presence on that day caused the earth to quake, signifying the fact that in Jesus' death on the cross, he was fulfilling a plan that God had set into motion before the very foundation of the world. This plan for the redemption of mankind. But I want you to stop and think for just a moment. When Jesus was nailed on that cross, those Jewish leaders probably breathed a sigh of relief. They probably said among themselves, you know what, the deed is done. There's this blasphemous traitor to the Jewish faith. We've taken care of him. Now we can get back to life as we are accustomed to living it. But they were so wrong. They were so mistaken in this. For they failed to realize what was going to happen on the other side of the cross. They failed to realize this transition that was taking place. Peter said in Acts chapter 2 and verse 23, he says, this man was delivered over by the predetermined plan and the foreknowledge of God. Folks, the Jews were just the catalyst that brought this plan to fruition. But it was God that set all of this in motion. It was God who fulfilled this plan. But then we flip on over a couple of pages and we come to Peter's second recorded sermon. And in this passage in Acts chapter 3 and verse 18, it says, but the things which God announced beforehand by the mouth of all the prophets that his Christ would suffer, he has thus fulfilled. Folks, what did the rocks declare on that day? They declared it is finished. They declared that God's plan has come to fruition. That this old covenant has now been fulfilled. The purpose of it has been fulfilled. And something greater and grander lies on the horizon. The rocks declared on that day, do you know what has happened? Do you see the significance of this occasion? Jesus went along with God's plan. Even though the night he was betrayed when he was there in the garden, he prayed to God and he asked God, said, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. But remember, he goes on to say, but nevertheless, thy will be done. He went along with God's plan, even though it wasn't really something that he looked forward to. It wasn't really something that he wanted to do. He didn't want to endure the pain and the agony of the cross. But he knew that in order to fulfill God's plan, that's what he had to do. And he revealed that willingness to us time and time again throughout the Gospels. In Matthew 17, verses 22 and 23 says, the man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. The Son of Man will be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day. Folks, Jesus knew what was going to happen. He knew what had to transpire in order for God's plan to be fulfilled. But not only that, in Matthew 20, verses 18 and 19, he says, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and will hand him over to the Gentiles to mock and scourge and crucify him, and on the third day he will be raised up. Friends, the rocks cried out on that day the fulfillment of God's plan. The fulfillment of all of these things that had been leading up to this final climax. In that earthquake, in the splitting of those rocks, it was declared, it is finished. But then number 3, the rocks also cried out on that day, and they said, get ready for what's coming. Get ready for what lies ahead. Folks, when Jesus cried out from the cross, it is finished, they didn't understand what he was saying in that statement. More than likely, they thought that what Jesus was saying is, I'm done. My life's over. I'm giving up the ghost. But no, what Jesus was saying is that all of the things that they had been doing that got them up to that point, all of the prophecies, all of the fulfillment of those prophecies, all of his teachings, preparing them for the kingdom to come, all of that was coming to a climax in this one act. And when Jesus cried out, it is finished, he was saying, get ready for what's about to happen. Be prepared for what lies ahead. In Jesus' death, a new covenant came into establishment. This old law that they were so accustomed to, that was so near and dear to their hearts, it passed away. It passed away along with Jesus. But this new covenant came into establishment. But Jesus understood that until he died on the cross, until the shedding of blood happened, that new covenant could not come into establishment. And this is why the Hebrew writer records for us in Hebrews chapter 9, verses 12 through 16, where he says that he entered into the holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For this reason, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that, since a death has taken place for the redemption of the transgressions that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. For where a covenant is, there must of necessity be the death of the one who made it. There must be the death of the testator. And Jesus could not bring this new covenant, this covenant of promise, this new and better covenant, as the Hebrew writer put it. That could not come into establishment until Jesus died. When Jesus shed his blood, when he gave his life on that cross, he ushered in a new era. And what Jesus was saying and what the rocks were proclaiming is it's never going to be the same. Consider that. Jesus said from now on everything's going to be different. Get ready for it. Be prepared. This new covenant is going to be different from what you're familiar with. It's going to be better than what you're familiar with. Get ready for it. Be prepared to accept that. And also, according to God's plan, from that point on, there would no longer be these earthly high priests. There would no longer be these earthly religious leaders like the scribes. For from that point on, Jesus would be our great high priest. Folks, everything was going to be different. Everything was going to be changed. Now consider this with me. Earthquakes have long punctuated the significance of God's actions. He signified this first covenant at Sinai with an earthquake. He used one now to signify the second covenant at the cross. But we're told in the future there's going to be another earthquake when Jesus comes again. When Jesus comes again, this earth is going to quake, and the rocks are going to cry out again. But when Jesus comes again, the rocks are going to cry out, "This is it. It is finished." Either you're prepared or you're not. Now, those who have their lives hidden in Christ, those who have been washed in the blood of the Lamb, those who have prepared for that day, it's going to be a glorious appearing. It's going to be a time that we are rejoicing, just like those disciples that were following Jesus into the city of Jerusalem, laying their coats on this animal for him to sit upon. They were going along and they were rejoicing. They were causing so much commotion that the Pharisees said, "Rebuke these men. Call these men down. Get on to them for what they're doing." Folks, when Jesus comes again, the saints are going to be rejoicing. But those who are not prepared, they're going to be begging for the earthquake to hide them from the face of God. In very figurative language, the book of Revelation chapter 6 verses 12 through 17 gives us a picture of this earthquake. It says, "I looked when he broke the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth, as a fig tree casts its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. The sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Then the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves among the rocks of the mountains, and they said to the mountains and to the rocks, 'Fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand?'" What John had revealed to him is this: all of those who were not prepared for the coming of Christ, all of those who did not take those necessary steps in order to live that faithful Christian life, they're going to do everything in their power to hide from the face of God. They're going to desire that the mountains would fall upon them, because in their minds the terror of that is less terrifying than standing before the judgment seat of Christ unprepared. Folks, just 1 week before Jesus died on the cross, as Jesus was making this triumphant entry into Jerusalem, the multitudes were shouting out. They were saying, "Blessed be the King that cometh in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." And some of the Pharisees from among the multitude said unto him, "Master, rebuke thy disciples." And he answered and said unto them, "I tell you that, if these should hold their peace, the stones would immediately cry out." Luke 19, verses 38 through 40. Brethren, this entrance into Jerusalem that seemed to be such a triumphant entrance turned out to be a tragic entrance, for it led to the death of Jesus. But the death of Jesus, that seemed to be such a tragic end, led to a triumphant display of the power of God. When the earth shook, when the rocks broke open, and the rocks cried out, they declared the glory of Jesus Christ. This morning, the question that we need to ask ourselves: are we declaring the glory of Jesus Christ in our life? The way that we live our life today, be it a faithful life or an unfaithful life, either declares the glory of Christ or declares that we are servants of this world. What are we declaring? When Christ looks at us, does he see us as a faithful child of God, a faithful servant of his? Or does he see us as someone who is in need of the saving power of the gospel? This morning we must examine ourselves. We must ask ourselves if we are in the faith, if our life is one that is pleasing to God at this time. This morning, if you examine yourself and you find things that are in your life that are not in keeping with God's will, things that are keeping you from serving God the way that you should, then we would encourage you this morning to make the decision that you're going to purge those things from your life. And come forward and make those things known, and let us go to the Father in prayer on your behalf and be restored to the faith if you are a child of God. Or this morning, if you've never obeyed the gospel, we would encourage you that if you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that you'll decide today that you will be a follower of Christ, that you'll set your sights on things above and come forward. Confess that you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. Be baptized. Have your sins washed away in the blood of the Lamb. Be raised to walk in newness of life. And leave this place today in a right relationship with the Father. Leave this place today proclaiming the glory of Jesus Christ. This morning, if you examine yourself and you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, please come while we stand and sing.